There are mainstream historians and scientists which are willing to openly admit without any issue that upwards of 30 to 50% of the planet's population died off only 600 or so years ago. To make matters even crazier, we find a situation to where upwards of 100% of entire populated towns, villages, and cities were wiped off the map in a mere span of months, if at worst a year. And this was all over the planet. If mainstream is willing to admit this kind of a death toll only a few hundred years ago, I mean, I don't know, you would think that that would matter to history. I mean, if you have entire towns and cities being wiped out by what is now blamed on the plague, I don't know, you would think that would probably affect history more than it is now. I mean, if you had entire cities today, like wiped off the map in the span of a year, like if all of New York City's population just died over a year, I mean, that would kind of be I would think that would be something you would want to really focus on when you study history in the future. You'd probably want to look at that and be like, whoa, wait a second, what the hell is going on? How do you wipe out that many people in such a short period of time? Now, right now, mainstream blames this on what they call
the plague.
This will be a continuation of the show that we started dealing with the plague and where we set the stage for how this supposed virus went around the planet and absolutely wiped out all human populations. Now, one of the interesting things that was discovered, ironically, by Dr. Fauci, yes, that Dr. Fauci, is that the virus has nothing to do with killing people. They actually discovered that a bacteria called Yersinia pestis was to be blamed on the deaths of essentially anybody that would have died by what was termed the plague. Of course, this is a problem for mainstream historians and scientists, because when they start to try and figure out what was going on with what we call the plague, and they try to blame it on this virus, that ends up not working. And this is acknowledged in the darker corners, I would say, of even mainstream. But of course, due to that, trauma-based psychological operation that all of us went through a couple of years ago, nobody can really talk about it like that anymore. So when we deal with the plague, we're not actually allowed to talk about the real science involved with how people actually died. How do you like that? That is literally the world you live in. You are not allowed to discuss the reality of what happened during the time when these plagues ravaged all kinds of populations throughout history. This is how you know, by the way, that all of mainstream history is completely corrupt. Or, okay, maybe not all of it, but like 99% of it is absolute trash. Because these people are not interested in looking at the truth. They're only interested in relaying what they have been taught to relay, right? They have been psychologically conditioned into one very specific narrative, and that narrative is the only narrative allowed. The problem is that when we start to look back at these plague times, and by plague times, I'm talking about everything from, the Justinian plague, all the way up to what we would term the Black Death, and everything in between. There's all these crazy plagues that for some weird reason happen between those two periods of time. Those two periods being the Justinian plague, and let's just say not just the Black Death, up to the 1600s. So 450-ish AD all the way to 1600-ish AD, we find a situation to where plague is all over the place throughout history. And I literally mean that. Even from a mainstream perspective, if you go and you just look specifically for plague stuff, you're just looking for diseases and plagues, what you find is all kind of recounts of all these various plagues apparently wiping out populations. So that's our time block that we are going to be operating within for any of these shows. And I don't know how many shows we can make on this, but this is probably not going to be the last one. Anyway, so we will always be focusing on time periods between 450-ish AD and 1600s-ish AD. And there's a very specific reason why we are going to do this. And the first reason is just like I said earlier, when you go and you start to read all the various works, not only of the works that are supposedly supposed to be from the relative time periods, but what you're also going to find is when you look at mainstream and you dig in deep enough, you'll find all of these recountings of all of these various plagues. However, the further back in time you go, the sketchier things start to get. Now that makes sense. I mean, you would think that the further we go back in history, the less reliable information we're generally going to have. And I think every single historian on this planet would acknowledge that to some degree, right? Because we do not have all of that detailed information from, say, 1000 AD. It's just not there. And I mean that in the truest sense. Like, we do not have works from those periods of time. And by works, I mean original. And then, of course, if you keep going further back and we march on backwards to, say, the Justinian era, we don't have any original works from that whatsoever. Every work that we have that is supposed to come out of that particular era, it's just copies of copies of copies of copies, translations of translations of translations. That is what we are operating within when we go further back in time. And yes, I realize that it sounds stupid to say that to some of you, but a lot of people don't really understand that when we look at history. We do not have the amount of evidence that mainstream acts as if we have. We don't have that kind of stuff. So, in my opinion, it's important to say that out loud even for myself, just to continue to remind myself and others around me that, yeah, we are screwed when it comes to trying to figure out what happened in the past, simply because we are dealing with an absolutely insane lack of evidence. Okay, you get that, blah, blah, blah. All right, so why is the plague important to talk about? What's going on here? Why waste our time with this? Well, the first reason is what I said at the very beginning of this show. The fact that we have even mainstream historians and scientists willing to admit that upwards of 100% of entirely populated cities with hundreds of thousands of people were wiped out in the span of, say, a few months to a year, and that potentially upwards to 50% of the world's population was completely wiped out during these plague periods in time. Just thinking about that for like 2 seconds, if you take that seriously, I mean, that is an insane period in human history, and it's essentially brushed to the side as if, oh yeah, it's perfectly normal for that many people to die that quickly, because, it's a simple virus that went out there and killed everybody, and whatever, bro, don't worry about it. That's what viruses do. They just wipe out huge chunks of humanity, and then we just move on. We don't have to pay attention to this in any great detail, because we understand everything, right? We understand how the plague works, and we understand how it was transmitted, and blah, blah, blah. They don't have any of that. That's the funny part, is not only do they not have any of that, but what was then discovered, like I said again earlier in the show, Dr. Fauci led a team that discovered what the actual killer was, and they discovered that it was that bacteria, Yersinia pestis. So right off the bat, once we start to analyze the plague situation in the light that the mainstream attempts to paint it in, and we just do a little bit more research, we immediately find all kinds of cracks in that historical story. So that's why it's important to actually look at this. Now, there's another reason why this is important. Well, there's all kinds of reasons. But the next reason why this is important is because when we start to read works that were written up by people who were there, who were eyewitnesses to all of these things that were taking place, what we find is that the plague that is killing people is not even probably the major killer of humans during these periods of time. We find a situation to where not only is the plague being described, but we have a situation to where we have comets in the sky, We have meteors raining down from the sky. We have blood raining down from the sky. We have blood erupting from the ground. We have poisonous, noxious gas, which they will call miasma, raining down from the sky and coming out of the earth during horrific earthquakes. Not only do we have all of that, but we find large tsunamis rushing into land all over this world, literally wiping out entire cities overnight, killing everybody. All of this is recounted when we start to dig only just a little deeper into even mainstream sources. So this is a problem right off the bat. I mean, it's one thing to have a plague kill off a bunch of people. Yeah, that sucks. But, generally speaking, we get the idea that, yeah, there could be biological organism things that are contagious that can go around and killing people. Like, we understand that. It sucks, but we understand at least the general science behind that, so we can accept that. But when we have writers talking about entire towns and cities being swallowed up by the earth, when we have gas raining down from the sky, and this noxious gas killing people the same way that the plague is described as killing people, we have a problem. The mainstream has a problem, because the mainstream has chosen to completely ignore all of this other evidence. To make matters worse for the mainstream is that we have all kinds of geological evidence that supports everything that the eyewitness testimonies are relaying to us. So the question has to be asked against mainstream is, why is all of this ignored? So for example, the gas situation, the miasma. Right now, mainstream literally considers our ancestors monkeys. And by the way, this is not a European-focused area. I know a lot of people think of the plague as being, oh yeah, it only happened in Europe and the rest of the world was 100% untouched. No, remember, I said upwards of 50% of the population of the planet died. The planet. That means this plague was everywhere. Now, this is acknowledged by mainstream scientists and historians as well, but chronology will get in the way and it will obfuscate a lot of this picture, and we will deal with that in this show as well. But we find a situation to where this plague is being described all over the planet, and all of these horrific, catastrophic events are also being described by cultures all over the planet as well. So when we find a situation to where not only one part of the world is suffering from some kind of a catastrophic event, but we find that cultures everywhere are suffering from the exact same kinds of events, this is where we have to start paying attention. I don't know what to tell people. You can't ignore this kind of stuff, right? When you see cultures in, Eastern Asia, and then Western Europe, and then in the Americas, and that includes North and South America, and Australia, I mean everywhere, when everybody is talking about these horrific catastrophes that were taking place only 600 years ago, we have to pay attention. Like it really is on us as scientists and historians to give this stuff a real look. Because if we ignore it, then what's the point? I mean, what's the point of our ancestors writing down all of this stuff, transmitting all of this stuff orally, if we're just going to toss it aside because right now we believe all of our ancestors were monkeys because they didn't have a computer or something like that, right? I think we can all agree that nowadays modern people are not what we would generally describe as highly intelligent. And I don't mean that as an offense to anybody. I'm in that same bucket. But holy crap, we have a situation psychologically in our modern society to where everybody thinks they're a damn expert on absolutely everything. But if you challenge them on any of the information that they are spewing and you take away their phone, watch how they fumble around in the dark. Watch how immediately dumb they become because they're attached to the internet, and the internet gives them a false sense of security relative to intellectual capability, which then inflates their ego, which then the mainstream latches onto and exploits, and they use that for control, blah, 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 blah. Okay. So, catastrophism. Let's use this segue to start there. Now, one of the reasons why the plague is fascinating is because not only is the plague, doing what it did, according to eyewitness testimonies, but, and of course, genetics, proves these bottlenecks that pop up throughout the populations of, humans throughout the past 1,000 years or so. But, the other side of this is that we run into a situation to where everybody is describing some kind of a crazy cosmological event taking place in the sky. And this cosmological event that is going on that everybody on the planet can see, or almost, it depends on where you are on the planet, and it would also depend on what was truly going on. Remember, I don't have the perfect information to give a 100% clear picture on everything that was happening during this time period, because even if something is going on up in the sky, right, you have some sort of a crazy comet, which everybody describes, that doesn't mean that everybody on the world is going to be able to see it, depending on where they are located geologically, or geographically, I should say. Some of these people are not going to be describing a comet simply because they could not see it in the hemisphere they are in. So when we start to try to do comparative history and we try to say, we take, the European, North Africa, Mediterranean stories, and we try to line that up with the Aboriginal stories in Australia, or anybody that was living in Australia, I guess at that period of time, and New Zealand as well, you're going to have a different picture. Simply or cosmologically, you are going to have a different picture because the people in Australia are just looking at a different portion of the sky relative to the people up in Europe. So in the European, or I should say in the Northern Hemisphere area, it seems like everybody had a very clear picture of some kind of a cometary event taking place. And it gets even weirder because it's not just one comet that everybody describes. When we start to look at the histories, we find all kinds of comets, all kinds of cosmological events taking place. And everybody describes this stuff, even the people on the southern hemisphere, right? They're seeing a different kind of fallout. So when they talk about meteors raining down, they may not have been able to ascribe it to the comet, and they don't, because they simply couldn't see it. But that does not mean that they were not hit with the meteors, and that does not mean they were not hit with like the gas and stuff like that. Okay, so we're already kind of sound schizo, right? So now we've gone from comets to gas to, wait, hold on, what's going on here? What the hell am I talking about? What does all this mean? All right. So, right now, history and science has really painted a picture of Earth's history just absolutely marred with all kinds of insane catastrophes. For example, one of those catastrophes would have been the Venus event, and I've discussed that in other shows, I won't recap it. But, when you have a cometary body the size of a planet, in this case Venus, doing a few flybys of Earth, and this is what everybody describes, you're going to have a lot of catastrophe and damage, and sure enough, that's exactly what happens, and that's what everybody talks about. But when you start having situations on that scale, catastrophic situations on that scale, the fallout from an event like that is not going to disappear overnight. Interestingly enough, it is going to disappear relatively quickly over the centuries. However, since the solar system had been through multiple crazy catastrophes, remember, it's not just Earth being affected by stuff. It's everything in the solar system that went through hell and back. And when the solar system went through hell and back, this creates all kinds of debris. Now, this is exactly what we would expect from any of these catastrophes that our ancestors recorded. And don't forget, these catastrophes are absolutely mind-boggling. And don't forget, these catastrophes are absolutely insane. We have planetary bodies literally smashing each other with giant thunderbolts. We have other, cosmological bodies doing something to each other physically that rips them apart. We have all kinds of mass destruction. We have the planet Earth being absolutely reshaped by cosmological events. With all of this happening in the solar system, this level of total destruction, we would expect to find, all kinds of debris scattered all over hell and back within our solar system, and that is exactly what history records having happened. You guys are probably more than familiar with pictures like this from the time periods between, 1200 to 1600 AD in the European Mediterranean area. During this period of time, if you look at the artwork that is being done, it is quite common to find all kinds of stuff going on up in the sky in their artwork. Like if you look over the towns and the cities that these people are drawing, they always have some sort of a comet or multiple comets. Sometimes the comets even have direct shapes. So for example, we can see a comet is described of having the shape of a sword. This kind of stuff exists everywhere, but the mainstream completely ignores it. It gets crazier too because people describe like multiple suns in the sky. I mean, like what the hell is going on? The reason why mainstream completely ignores all of this documented information is because it just sounds crazy, right? I mean, for example, we have a description of multiple suns in the sky during a particular period during the plague time. What do you do with that if you're a historian and you believe in the theory of uniformity and you believe in modern cosmology, right? You have no way of looking at this kind of information with a fresh perspective. When you see stuff like this as a mainstream historian, you just have to think that, well, I guess our ancestors are crazy and stupid, or yeah, maybe there was one comet that passed by during this time. That's not impossible. I mean, we know it would have happened. So yeah, they drew it, but they were monkeys, so they ascribed, all the gas, or well, not even the gas, they just described or ascribed the plague to a comet because they didn't understand what was going on, and so that's how it went. And so all of this stuff is then discarded by the mainstream as useless information. I beg to differ completely. If our ancestors are drawing comets in the sky, if they are drawing what they even call in one case objects having a war up in the sky, I don't know what that's about, by the way, but maybe we'll talk about that in a different show. The main point is, ultimately, is that we find everybody describing events taking place cosmologically. Mainstream ignores it. We are not. There's two reasons why we cannot ignore it. The first reason is that if we are going to be academically and intellectually honest, which is what everybody should be trying to do, we have to look at all of the evidence regardless of how we feel about it. Never forget, science does not care about your feelings. So mainstream historians, they completely operate on their feelings. Oh, well, I feel that our ancestors were stupid and they did not know what they were talking about, so I must be right. So we're going to continue on with that. That's literally their perspective. We can't take that perspective. If our ancestors record something, regardless of the format, and by that I mean whether it's written or oral or, some other representation, we have got to pay attention to this. Now, if all of the catastrophism stuff that we are starting to discover is indeed real, we would expect to find our ancestors all the way up until a couple of centuries ago still really dealing with that cosmological fallout. One of the fallouts that we would expect would be debris up in space. So we would expect our ancestors to actually continue to see, the remnants of various, asteroids, meteors, comets, etc., still flying around the solar system. And sure enough, that is exactly what we continue to see all throughout history after some of these major cataclysmic events. So for example, the Venus event was probably the last absolutely crazy major cataclysm. And that absolutely would have shredded Earth, it shredded Venus, it did all kinds of damage, it absolutely threw debris everywhere. And that debris is going to take some time to clean itself up. Now, you might be asking something like, all right, but wait, if all of that crazy stuff that you've talked about so far is true, I mean, that would really cause one hell of a debris field. Yes, true, and I agree. But wouldn't that debris take millions and billions of years to essentially clean itself up? Because right now, mainstream cosmology says that everything operates under the force of gravity. Gravity is the main driver of everything in the universe. The problem with gravity is that gravity is a weak force. So if we pair a weak force that is going to intrinsically not allow things to happen quickly with the theory of uniformity, we get a situation to where the vast majority of people on this planet now believe that everything takes millions and billions of years to happen. So if the solar system went through all of this crazy stuff and all of this debris, was created only a few thousand years ago, remember, these events are not millions and billions of years old. These events are only millennia old. The oldest one is probably only somewhere between 8 to 15,000 years old, right? And that would be the Saturn event. So this is not that long ago. So if we have all that debris floating around, we should still see it today, shouldn't we? Now, on one hand, we do still see it today, right? We still literally have, asteroid fields hanging out there. They're there, they're chilling, they exist. But we should also see a lot more just random debris flying around, shouldn't we, right? And if you are operating under the gravity-only theory, yeah, you really should expect to find that. However, what has been discovered is that gravity is not the primary driving force in the universe. We now know that electricity and electromagnetism are truly the forces that create everything that we see in cosmology. Now, for a mainstream cosmologist, they are deathly afraid of electricity in space because it completely invalidates everything that they are currently doing, or at least almost everything that they are doing. The good news is that the James Webb Telescope has completely proven the electric universe theory correctly, whereas it has destroyed the mainstream dark matter, dark energy universe that current cosmology believes in. Of course, mainstream cosmologists are ignoring all of this evidence that has destroyed their theory. And of course, they're doing that because of their egos and because they're stubborn and because of their training and blah, blah, blah. But you get the point. Anyway, so if we look at real science, we take real science and we apply that to the real world, not like, mainstream cosmologists and mainstream scientists. We're going to do real science. And once we start to do real science and we employ electromagnetism, suddenly we have a force that is 10 to the 36 times more powerful than gravity. If everything is being driven by electricity or electromagnetism more specifically, that means that the solar system would reorganize itself very, very quickly. And that is exactly what we witness. When you and I look up at the sky today, we do not see all kinds of debris flying around. In fact, a comet is rare to see nowadays, even though actually I was lucky enough to see one a couple of days ago or a week or so ago. Maybe I'll post that picture if I remember that during editing. But the reality is, comets are not common anymore. You're lucky if you see one in your entire life. For those of you who have seen a few, congratulations. But that's not the norm, right? These kinds of cosmological events are very rare relative to our period of time. So why is it that when we start to look further and further back in history, and for this particular show, we will just talk between 500 AD to 1600 AD, we find everybody dealing with comets. We find everybody recording comets, not only just like one comet, but we find people talking about multiple comets in the sky. And we find a situation to where people are even describing these comets changing forms in the sky as well. These events are documented not just in one little area, but they are documented anywhere that the populations were able to see the events take place. This is a problem for mainstream historians, because what this says is that the night skies back during these periods of time were not calm. Our ancestors were literally, and I mean literally, still watching the solar system clean itself up after those catastrophes. This is why it is so important to pay attention to cosmological observations that are being made in these older documents or these older oral stories, because they really do tell the story of exactly what we should expect to find if Earth went through all of this crazy stuff. Now, during this period of time, while the solar system is cleaning itself up, everything is moving around and changing. And of course, Earth is either going to get in the path of this debris, or the debris is going to get in the path of Earth. And that is exactly what we see. And that is exactly what is described by our ancestors. So when we look back at those catastrophes now, we say, hey, we can ask the legitimate question, what happened to all of the debris? I mean, where did it all go? Yes, nowadays everything seems very calm, but it should not have been that calm, like 1,000 years ago or so. And sure enough, it was not. And in fact, there's even one more minor cataclysm that happens from the fallout of the major ones that will create probably more debris. Anyway, we'll get into that in a completely different show. So, during the plague periods of time, our ancestors are recording all of these cosmological events. While they are recording those events, they are also talking about the fallout from just what they're witnessing in the sky. They specifically say, as this comet approached Earth, and it was bright, right? They talk about real bright comets. These are not far away, distant, very faded little, tails kind of coming out in a wispy way, and it's really far away, and it's nothing like that. These comets are right there in the sky. These guys can see the head glowing right there, and in fact, it sounds like we even run through the tail of some of these comets during this period of time. Now, if we went through the tail of a comet, we would expect something to happen. We would expect, at the very least, for the Earth to dim during the occasions when we run into these cometary tails, and that is exactly what is described during the plague period of time. We find periods to where the sun does not show up for months or even a couple of years at a time. The reason why this happens is not just because some volcanoes start to erupt, and they do. We'll get to that in a second. But it's because we're in the tail of a comet. So when we get in the tail of a comet that we are that close to, and that could potentially have been large, I'm not talking large like a planetary body, much, much smaller, maybe 20, 30, 50 miles in circumference or something like that. Maybe even bigger, I don't know. But nothing planetary, nothing like the size of the moon or anything like that. But, a large cometary body, ejecting all of its plasma in its tail, and we run into it, that's going to be all of those particles getting into our atmosphere, and then our atmosphere would have dimmed. And that is exactly what is described in all of the histories. So once again, the catastrophe story continues to march on with real evidence. Now, of course, mainstream ignores all of this stuff. They just say, well, a volcano erupted and it was really bad, and then, the world was really cool for a while, and whatever, we move on. The question is, why did that volcano erupt? Or why did multiple volcanoes erupt? Once again, you can blame the cometary body on the eruptions of the comet. The reason why is because a comet is a charged body. As a charged body approaches a differently charged body, there are going to be electromagnetic interactions. These electromagnetic interactions will show themselves on Earth in the form of things like aurora, which is also described all over the planet during this period of time. We are going to find volcanic eruptions because the Earth is now essentially reacting to the differently charged body in certain areas, depending on where the charges are and, all of that stuff. That's a whole complicated thing, but we'll just stick to the basics. So the cometary charge is going to affect the crust, so you're going to get some volcanoes, and ultimately you are also going to get earthquakes. Don't forget, earthquakes are essentially just lightning in the Earth. It is not plates grinding on each other, all right? That's not what's going on. Once you have these electromagnetic disturbances from the comet, earthquakes, volcanoes, the tail, etc., all of this stuff, right, you're going to run into a smaller catastrophic event. And sure enough, all of these things are described precisely by our ancestors. if our ancestors were just making this stuff up. Because another thing that mainstream historians will say is that during the plague period, everybody was just a crazy religious zealot. So, they just describe anything from the Bible to make it sound like it makes sense to them. And, and that's what they did. So it's all fake. It's all garbage. No, not at all. If these people are seeing comets in the sky, we would expect the electromagnetic body of the comet to affect Earth in the ways that Earth gets affected, and this is what they describe. This means that all of these accounts could be considered scientific documentation. How do you like that, right? It's insane. All the answers are right there in front of us, and most people are trained to ignore them. I was trained to ignore them too. Don't worry, I am not above any of that psychological programming. I'm right there with you guys. But once you break out of it, even just a little bit, the entire worldview falls apart immediately. All right, so anyway, so we have all this crazy catastrophe stuff going on. It's described by all the cultures, and we've just explained scientifically why we would expect all of that stuff going on. Now, one of the fallouts from the comet is the earthquakes. When we read plague documentation, we literally find entire towns and cities being swallowed up during these earthquakes. And it's not just in the European Mediterranean area. We find this happening all over the planet. Not only are we finding cities and villages being swallowed up, losing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, not from the plague, but from all of the catastrophic damage that is described due to the comet. So when we look at the death numbers of the plague, don't forget, it's not just the plague that's doing this. Now, don't get me wrong. Yersinia pestis would have killed people. That nobody's going to argue that, and we'll get into that in a second, eventually. But the death toll numbers, it's not just the plague. Because don't forget, scientifically speaking, there were a bunch of studies done where scientists went out and they dug up a bunch of graveyards of people who would have technically have been killed by the plague during this period of time. And what they found is that the vast majority of people who were dead were not infected with Yersinia pestis. Yes, some of them had died from it, but the vast majority had not. So that was not the number one major killer. And of course, when they went to look for any kind of an influenza-based death, they found nothing. Nobody was dying from influenza. That didn't happen. The flu is not killing anybody. It's the bacterium. But the bacterium did do its thing. I mean, I'm not trying to downplay the bacterium. It absolutely burned through a bunch of other populations. It's just interesting to note that not all of the deaths, like the historians like to claim, came from specifically the plague. The deaths came from all kinds of the damages that were being done to this planet cosmologically. Now, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, this did indeed burn through some of the populations of the world. This is not up for debate. This happened, and I want this is a problem. So let's deal with it finally, right? After 40 minutes of just blabbing about comets, now we can talk about the actual plague. Okay, so the plague. Yeah, we're getting there. So here's the problem that we run into when we start to look at the plague. There's a few problems. The first problem I covered in the first show, and that is not a lot, all of the symptoms that are supposedly supposed to be related to the plague event can also be related to radiation sickness and radiation poisoning. This is exactly what our ancestors described. This would explain why we find these killer miasma clouds floating around from up under the earth and, raining down from the sky. All of our ancestors described these clouds killing people very, very quickly. Basically, if you were exposed to one of these clouds, you were almost guaranteed death, unless you were able to get out really quick, or, maybe you got lucky and the radiation dose was not all that high. But this goes a long way into explaining why so many people had all of these symptoms that looked like the plague, but may have in fact been from radiation poisoning. Now, that does not mean Yersinia pestis does not exist. It does. While this radiation exists, and I have no, I gotta be honest, it seems like, yes, it did kill a lot of people. And that's what the evidence shows. But Yersinia pestis, for whatever reason, does also start to proliferate during this period of time. We need to ask the question, why? I mean, Yersinia pestis still exists today. You know, it's not like we got rid of it. It's still there. So we all need to ask the question, why are we all not dying of the plague? I mean, if we look back in history and we see, 50, 60% of the planet dying from this thing, what happened today? I mean, why are we not dealing with this on the scale that our ancestors dealt with it? And you can take that question one step further and you can ask, how come it only happens between 450 AD and 1600-ish AD? What's going on there? How come our ancestors before that, they don't really describe any of these crazy plagues? Don't get me wrong. I know there's sicknesses and stuff way back in ancient history, and it might be related to this actually. But generally speaking, before 450 AD, before Justinian, there's not really a lot of talk of mass plagues killing the planet. Nobody's really complaining about that. They're complaining about the planet Venus, flying by Earth, right? They're complaining about the other planets messing with Earth. They're not too concerned with sickness because they're dealing with planetary bodies and wondering if they're going to wake up tomorrow and be absolutely just annihilated by, some sort of a cosmological event. That was their problem, and that's what they talk about. So why do we find this particular period of time so destructive? Well, we might have an answer. So Yersinia pestis exists, and we now know that if you can charge bacteria with positive ions, if you can create an environment, an electrical environment that ups the positive ion count in the area, you can supercharge a bacteria. So if we have an other electrically charged body or bodies flying by Earth, and it's messing with Earth's electromagnetic field and just the general electromagnetic situation in the general area of space, it's potentially possible that this is what charged up Yersinia pestis so that it could spread as quickly as it did. Then, if you factor in radiation and what that could have potentially also done to this bacterium, who knows what could have happened, right? I mean, so we have a huge catastrophic events going on. We have a deadly bacterium, which is now essentially being supercharged, and Earth has to deal with all of this. Now, if everything I just talked about, the positive ion situation, the radiation, all the catastrophes and the comets, if none of this was real, if all of this was just fake BS, we shouldn't find all the evidence that we do currently find that supports it 100%. There's nothing we can do. The evidence is what the evidence is. Now, relative to the bacterium and how it operates within a different electrical environment, this is still an ongoing scientific study situation. Unfortunately, most scientists are probably not really looking into it because they don't think this stuff matters all that much. But there are good scientists doing it, and so this is still an area of study that is not finalized. So hey, if you're into this stuff and you actually can do, if you have access to these kinds of labs and tools, go test this stuff. Go throw some bacteria in a little culture dish and see what happens when you charge the crap out of it. I mean, I know we already kind of do that in school. So anyway, but all that's there. So if this didn't happen, if the comets were not raining down radiation, if the comets were not changing the electrical environment, if Yersinia pestis was not being supercharged, we should not see all of the stuff that we do see our ancestors recording. I mean, it's there. We have to deal with it. And right here, we have potential answers. We have a ton more to talk about, and I'm not going to get through any of it in this show. But we have time for one more foundational aspect of the plague that we have to get out of the way before we can truly appreciate and understand what actually happened during this period of time. So during this show, I've told you guys, hey, we're looking at something called the plague that took place between 450-ish AD to 1600-ish AD. The reason why I give those dates is because those are the dates that mainstream chronology currently ascribes to times of plague. Mainstream chronology, to be blunt, is completely wrong. When we look at the plague situation, we actually start to find all kinds of cracks in the narratives with respect to this time frame. Now on this channel, I have tried to go to great lengths to show you guys, scientifically speaking, that mainstream chronology is not just a little wrong, but that it is almost entirely wrong. Now, I know that sounds like one hell of a claim, but the science is what the science is. So when we look at the plague situation from a mainstream perspective, you're given a list of dates that vary between the 450 AD to the 1600s. There's a spot in there where several centuries are not talked about or not mapped out at all, and this would kind of be the Dark Age periods. To be blunt, the Dark Ages don't exist. So if the Dark Ages don't exist, that means that whatever periods of time that the mainstream has no information on, we can essentially, scientifically, completely delete that period of time. So that immediately gets rid of like between 300 to 500 to possibly 600 plus years of history that never happened. Historians are hilarious when they talk about something like the Dark Ages, because if you ask them to prove that the Dark Ages existed, they will come back to you and say, we don't have any evidence of this period of time. How can I prove it to you? They literally believe that a period in time exists. And this is multiple centuries, by the way. They think a particular period of time exists, but they have zero evidence for its existence. I don't know how to say how dumb that, I mean, how stupid is that? What are you supposed to do with that? When somebody will look you dead in the eye and say, I have no evidence that this exists, but it happened, bro, trust me. That's just where you got to start slapping people, dude. I mean, that's just where you look at them, you just like grab them by the neck and just slam your forehead right into their head. Then they start bleeding out like, oh, stop headbutting me. And just like, shut up. You just grab it and just smash it into the wall a couple of times, drag it into your knee, lift them up over your head and just, The issue of the chronology with respect to when the plague shows up immediately becomes a problem because historians are literally missing centuries of data that would prove what they are talking about. So if mainstream historians don't have any evidence to support their chronological claims, how are we supposed to deal with this with respect to the plague? To make it even weirder, as a chronologist, when you start to look at the evidence that the mainstream has that at least tries to support, at least like say the Justinian plague, for example, right? You go and you look at the Justinian plague, and the way mainstream historians say or talk, if you just listen to them and only them, they make it sound like they have this whole plague mapped out. That the Justinian plague was this horrific plague, did all this stuff, and they must have a ton of evidence to support all of these claims because mainstream historians can quite literally write entire volumes of books that somehow flesh out a period in time that was 1600 years ago. How are they doing this? Well, that's a question that the vast majority of people don't ask, to be blunt. Right? Because the mainstream historian really does have a good, they are very good nowadays of making it sound like they know what they're talking about. Here's the problem. If you actually go and look at the sources that try to support the Justinian plague, we run into an immediate problem. And the problem is this. The vast majority of writings that are currently ascribed to this period of time, 450-ish, to maybe 500 AD, I'll give it that. The vast majority of these works either do not mention the Justinian plague at all, or if they mention any kind of a plague during this period of time, they only mention a very small side, brief little sickness that affected a couple of towns, but ultimately did not kill, hundreds of millions of people. Yeah, there were a few maybe towns and villages that got sicknesses, but that's life. Sometimes people get sick, and that's the way it's portrayed. There is only one work that exists that makes the Justinian plague sound like it was this horrific event. And that is the work of Procopius of Caesarea. This Constantinople scholar is the only book that we have that describes the Justinian plague as any kind of completely destructive event. That's it. It's only Procopius. Like I said, the other authors that mention it, if they mention it at all, they really only mention it as a side thing. So basically, all of mainstream historians are banking on Procopius being 100% honest. Of course, if you've listened to this channel, it gets infinitely worse for anybody believing the Procopius story. So we now know that the vast majority of the time periods, essentially between 200-ish AD up until about 12 to 1300-ish AD, is a completely blank slate. The only reason why it seems like we have any information about any of the time that happens during this particular period of time is because miraculously, during the Renaissance, all of a sudden, all of these history books started to magically appear. During this time period, forgeries were literally an industry. And I mean that in the truest sense. There were people during the Renaissance and beyond that started up literal factories of people creating forged books to sell to collectors or to sell to people who needed history portrayed in a very particular way for whatever they were trying to accomplish, right? For their own greed, for their own avarice, etc. This is where all of this history magically comes from. I ask you a basic question. Do you think that's a reliable source for history? A time period that even mainstream historians acknowledge is a period of nothing but forgeries? When we look at Procopius, do you really think that Procopius was a real person? Do you really think Procopius was writing anything that was actually real? Well, maybe. That's a possibility. But did Procopius actually know what he was talking about relative to 452 AD? The answer is simply probably not at all, because that period in time simply never existed. There was more than likely no such thing as the Justinian plague or the Justinian period in the sense that we know it today. If Justinian actually existed, and there's evidence that he did not live in 450 AD. He would have lived more towards the 1100s to the 1200s AD. Yeah, this is real chronology, and I've talked about all of this stuff on other shows, so I'm not going to go into depth. Just go look up on that stuff to get some more details. And we have a lot more to talk about in other shows, so I'm not even close to being done. But the fact that we know for a fact that mainstream chronology is almost completely manufactured, when we start to look at the plague situation, we have to ask ourselves, how much of this is accurate and how much of the chronological time periods that the plague takes place in is accurate as well? So we run into a situation to where suddenly we have to start to compress time. If the time periods between 300-ish or 200-ish AD to 1100-ish AD never existed, that means that the Justinian plague, if it was real, is suddenly bumped up into the 14-ish or 13-ish hundreds. All of the dates start to shift. Now, the next problem that we are going to run into with the plague is also other books trying to nail down years relative to what they would have considered history. In the first episode of this little plague series that we're doing here, I read from a book that was called A General Chronological History of the Air, Weather, Seasons, Meteors, and in Sundry Places and Different Times, more particularly for the space of 250 years. Yes, that is the entire title of the book. Yes, it's insane. But anyways, this book, is written at a way later date after all of these plagues happen. But what this book tries to do is it tries to give an entire chronology for centuries before this author ever existed. Now, when this guy is writing, in 1749, he does not have access to the internet. So what this author did is he tried to establish some kind of a chronology relative to his understanding of the period of time. So you see things like what you see on your screen. He just gives years and he tries to give all of the events of all of these years. Now this guy is drawing from all of these Renaissance forgeries to try and put together a chronology. So this immediately, well, the first thing it does is you have to ask, why am I paying attention to this book at all if it is a potential, backed up by forgeries? And the second thing is how reliable is this in any capacity then? Well, this is where things get a little weird, because a lot of the forgeries that were coming out of the Renaissance, it's not that they were all lies and forgeries. There were a lot of them, don't get me wrong, but there were a lot of books that just came out and were actually just describing what was going on during their period of time, in the 1400s or so. But later on, historians would take those writings and they would send them back over 1,000 years. So suddenly, an event that took place in the 1200s was now all of a sudden taking place, in 100 AD instead of 1200 AD. That's how mainstream historians have screwed with chronology. And of course, this is being orchestrated by people way up top, right? I mean, these people have zero interest in you knowing the truth. And there's nothing, weird or conspiracy theory about that. That is a scientifically proven fact. There is nothing to argue with on that, by the way. So don't come at me with conspiracy theory crap. It's just a fact. This is the world that you live in. Anyway, when we look at books like this, these books further muddy the water, because if you were to take this 100% at face value, then you would ascribe all of these events into all of these different years. What this author was ultimately trying to do is he was trying to make sense out of all the crazy stuff that he was reading in all of these books. He ends up making the exact same mistake that many other historians around his time and before his time end up making. He starts to look at all of these events as completely separate events. So if you were to read through this book, you will find that it's full of all kinds of catastrophes. However, including the plague. However, what we find is that he's got these events spread over decades and centuries. The reality, chronologically speaking, is that all of these events were not spaced out over 1,000 years. They were instead spaced out maybe within a few decades, or maybe a little longer, but not much longer. These events, this plague situation, did not linger for hundreds and hundreds of years. When we start to look how the plague really does flow throughout chronology, it's kind of all over the map. But I mean, it really only hangs out most of the time for a couple of years, and then it burns itself out apparently and disappears. Then it shows up again magically somewhere else, burns itself out and disappears. You see this all over the place, and you see this in the chronology. The reality is all of these events, all of these cities and villages that are getting hit by this plague and that are getting hit by all of these catastrophes, they're not spread out over 1,000 years. They all happen around the exact same period of time. The reason why this author for this book, for example, doesn't put this together is because by his time, he has absolutely no real reference to any kind of real cosmological catastrophes. And he certainly does not have any real first-hand information to really get into the details of the stuff that he's talking about because he wasn't there, and he does not have the most reliable chronological works to source off of. So what people do is, what historians during these periods of time did is, so instead of just saying, hey, look, all of this stuff really did happen at the same time, we don't have to space them out, they space them out to make them sound more realistic. Because psychologically, they can't comprehend a reason why all of this stuff would have happened only a few hundred years before their existence. So you have to watch out for stuff like that when we read these things. Now, that does not mean that the things in this book are wrong. A lot of the stuff that, for example, in this book and other ones, the events actually happen because we find a situation to where everybody all over the world corroborates each other. even more interesting, when we step out of the European Mediterranean area and we start to look at the other cultures on the other continents, we find that they are not spacing out any of these events. They are putting them all together in one bunch and bundle that would have taken place within a couple of years realistically, right? It's only really a European historical situation that tries to split all of these events all over hell and back so that it can make it sound like nothing crazy happened. And these people are not probably trying to do this on purpose. They just don't know how else to figure out the problem that they're facing, right? And it sounds good. And then you get a publishing deal and then you live on with life and who cares, right? And so this gets put into history. And that is what our history is based on. So basically, chronology is completely wrong. The plague events that we are talking about in these shows did not happen over a span of 1,000 years. They all take place at one very specific time in history, and that time in history is probably around 600 to 700 years ago. Basically, what I'm saying is that all of the plagues that have essentially been described, from Justinian all the way up until around the Black Plague situation, all of those plagues are not different plagues. They are all the same plague. And all of the catastrophes that are described that go along with these plagues, they all happen simultaneously on the planet as well. We do not have dozens of years in between all of these events. It is one major event that hits the planet, the comets do their pass-by, the effects happen, and then it comes to a miraculous end. This is exactly what we see when we take an objective look at the plague chronology. So right from here, we have a completely different understanding of what was going on not all that long ago. The ramifications for this kind of event, by the way, happening not that long ago, really does put humanity in a completely different perspective. And then if you keep rewinding the clock, just another couple of thousand years, and you start running into the major cataclysms, I mean, humanity is not at all what we are told by the mainstream. I mean, it's not even close. Our history, as far as I can tell, human history really is fairly brief. And I do not mean that in some sort of a weird young earth creation situation. Remember, I do not believe in God or gods or whatever, right? I'm just looking at the evidence objectively. And, the reality is we have not been here that long, and humanity has been absolutely devastated multiple times throughout history to where we almost went extinct. And this has happened relatively recently. I mean, literally only maybe 600-700 years ago, we had upwards of 60% of the world dying off. I mean, that's crazy. Now, another thing to note with respect to the chronology, this is still a semi-gray area that we're still trying to figure out. And there's way more information that we have to go to relative to what this event really did and what it actually means. But that's outside of scope for this. So if you're wondering, why or if this is connected to other aspects of other kinds of stories across the planet, yes, you're probably right to some degree, and we'll cover that in a different show. All right, so let's wrap it up. So basically, what we've discovered and discussed in this show is this. The Black Plague was potentially caused by and accelerated by a cometary body, a charged cometary body. Radiation probably played some sort of role, not only in potentially mutating the bacterium, but definitely killing massive amounts of people on this planet. The influenza situation that everybody tries to blame on the deaths is 100% scientifically not responsible for deaths. It is the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The death toll itself was not completely caused by Yersinia pestis. A lot of the death comes from natural disasters happening on the planet caused by this comet passing by. But those are not the only events that humanity suffers during this time of plague. And we will discuss those points in the next episode. So we'll just keep going with this, whatever the hell this is. Okay.